Hi, and welcome to another episode of a Bible study. And this one is the second creation story. We are in Genesis 2, 4b through 25. And my hope is that maybe you've already read it. If you have not, I will read it at the end, and then you can go back and forth with it. But just a little bit of interest with this story, because this is our second creation story. Genesis 1, first creation story, Genesis 2, our second creation story. And what's even more fascinating, this Genesis 2 story is older, like possibly a few hundred years older than Genesis 1. And the author here, it is understood to be part of the J tradition, the Yahwehist tradition. And yes, Yahweh starts with Y, but Yahweh translated into German means it's translated into Jehovah. So that's how we get the J tradition. And the J tradition, it's characterized by the name Yahweh, and it's being used from the very beginning of the human story. And J's purpose was political in the sense of writing and justifying the political and social realities of the Israelite monarchy in the time of King David and King Solomon. And that the actions of God that J describes, they're very human, personal, and this word of anthropomorphic, meaning that God is described as if God were a human being, hearing, walking, talking. So we get a sense of kind of where J is coming from, and J's tradition, it's about real people. And J's tradition doesn't idealize the people. They have moral flaws, just like we understand today. People are imperfect. Also, J, a lot of it is a part of the narrative of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. And one of the themes of J's work is that it is often repeated of human trial and failure. Like the human attempts to play God and then fails at it. J uses a distinctive vocabulary, such as Sinai, as opposed to the E tradition, the Elohim tradition, which calls it Horab. Also, it's a basic message, part of J, is that Yahweh's will to salvation overcomes human faithlessness. So, yes, humans screw up, but God still loves. God is still saying we belong to God. And that happens again and again. And it often, with the J tradition, it shows a lack of trust, right? Humans have a very difficult time in trusting God's way, of trusting that God's way is better than our way, and that God still loves us, even in that. As I said before, the dating of this probably a few hundred years before Genesis 1. So we're actually looking at the 10th to the 9th century BCE, and it's being written during the early monarchy period. Possibly a story that has connections with King David, and we'll kind of get to that. But it's also interesting to note that the scholarship around when did the Hebrew language develop as a written word? It's being spoken. So this is a story that may have been spoken during David's time, but it seems that the Hebrew language as a written form is further developed during the time of King Solomon. There's got to be enough peace for the language to develop, for scholarship to take hold, instead of constantly being afraid in the ways of we have to survive, and that's where all the energy goes. King Solomon had a long enough period of peace so that scholarship could develop, so that the written language of Hebrew could be developed. And as we're thinking about language, in Genesis 2, 4b, through the end of the chapter, we get some words. Yahweh, which is the YHWH, it gets translated as Lord. And when we see the word God, so we may see Lord God, and Elohim is being translated as God. And so why it's being used as both is that it is seen as there's a redactor, there's an editor that's trying to smooth out between the priestly tradition of Genesis 1 and all the way to where it switches fully over to the Yahweh tradition, the J tradition in chapter 4. So you get Lord God, so that it's showing a connection between the passages, that it's not totally incongruent with one another. We also get an interesting here about it's important for us to note the Hebrew word of Hadam in that word. And you may be thinking, did I just hear the name of Adam in there? It is part of that word. Hadam means earth creature or human. And it's fascinating because this term actually has an androgynous side and when referring to humanity. So it can just mean human, but then it can also refer to one, the man. So it's kind of a fascinating play there. Also, it is connected to the word Hadamah, which means the soil, which in Genesis 2, it is all about how humanity comes out of the soil and God breathes into. And that word for breath that gets translated as breath is ruah, and it can mean wind or spirit as well as breath. And it gives life by God dwelling in us. And so it is that sense of a deep connection with God from the very beginning, and that the breath of God, a part of God, is in us, is giving us life, all of humans' life. And then the word for Eden being understood as meaning pleasant or blissful. It also refers to delicacies and delight. And then the word Ezer, the EZER, which gets translated as helper, meaning to support or help. And it can also be translated as companion. And when that word gets used, sometimes it gets interpreted as that helper is less than. So when the woman is created and is less, some have translated as less than the man. But here's what's fascinating about that. That word Ezer is also used to refer to God. In fact, you can see it in Exodus 18:4, Psalm 10:14, and Psalm 118, verse 7. And so to recognize that God is referred to as our helper, as our companion, just as the woman is referred to in that way to the man in Genesis 2. The words that get translated for female, it's the word Issa, and then male is is. So you can see also the play of the words, the Hebrew words being deeply connected and being interconnected, so that it shows that all of creation, all of humanity is together. And then even at the very end there's a word, BWS, which is the transliteration of the Hebrew, but it can be translated as nakedness, but it's stronger towards that of shame, and that there is to be no shame, that the male and female at the end of the passage, they have no shame as they stand there without any clothing, that they are not ashamed of being vulnerable. And to think about that, the importance of not having shame in vulnerability. With respect to geography, the only thing we get in Genesis 2 is that of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is still present in what is modern day Iraq. But to recognize that the other rivers that are mentioned, we don't have a concept of where they may be. So a little bit of geography, but not a pinpointing, because that's not really what's totally important here. In fact, even when thinking about archaeological understanding or what's been uncovered, really Genesis 1 through 11, there's very little in the way of archaeology and of geography, because that's not really the point. It's trying to understand this connection between God and humanity. And when thinking about some interesting things as you go through the passage, how God acts by molding the earth person, the human, from bits of topsoil on the ground. And this should actually remind us, this is the importance of going through Genesis and understanding the images of where they connect throughout the biblical text. It connects to the work of the potter in Isaiah 29:16, or the metal worker of Isaiah 44:10. And then another piece is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and especially when we talk next week about Genesis 3. And this phrase of tree of knowledge of good and evil, it appears only in Genesis 2. And it's helping us understand that there is an age where people couldn't discern between good and evil, and that only can they gain that ability. And we can look at especially King David and King Solomon of getting that kind of like understanding of good and evil, that they are given that ability by God. We can find it 2 Samuel 14:17. Also, Solomon prays that he might be granted the ability to discern between good and evil in order to govern well. You can find that in 1 Kings 3:9. And so this is all about how people gain moral judgment and ethical action, but with the importance of God is supposed to be granting that, like David and Solomon are granted that by God, and that it comes from an experience of experiencing God. But with the tree in the garden, it offers access to this moral capacity in an unnatural way by eating rather than by growing or receiving divine understand, like a divine, like God is granting it. And for us to think about that and hold on to that, especially as we get into that further next week. Also, to recognize that the garden requires tending. So the earth creature, the human, is to work and take care of it. And that humanity is given the power to name, yet it doesn't result in an appropriate companion. Because Genesis 2 has a different order of creation. The human is created first and then everything after. Whereas in Genesis 1, it started with everything else and ended with humanity. In fact, even with this talk about the phrase of the tree of garden of good and evil, is to recognize that God tells human, the man, of, hey, guess what? You're not supposed to eat of it, but the woman has not yet been created. So we're not sure if the woman has received that knowledge by secondhand, or if there has been some kind of contact. It's just kind of interesting to think about how this story unfolds. And to also question and understand how in this story that this garden, the Garden of Eden, is supposed to be perfection, and that God is present with the human, and that it's not enough, that the man needs a partner. And so then the animals are created and the man goes through naming, and it's still not enough because humans were created to be in relationship with others, with other humans. And so there's a sense there then of what is the purpose of this story trying to get at, of the need humans have for connection to one another. That yes, God is with us, and yes, there is this beauty of creation that surrounds us, but we are also in need of companionship in one another. And so that is part of what the text is trying to convey, is that we are in need of relationship. It also is trying to convey that God breathed the life into human bodies, and that these bodies that God created, it's not the locus of evil, but it's the locus of good, because God formed it with God's own hands. So the goodness of God being breathed into humanity. And that another aspect of this, it's trying to convey that humans are intended to labor, not to sit idly and simply pick fruit, but that work is important and it's not a curse. And it's part of the divine economy that together God and humans are responsible for preserving the earth, that we do this together. We create and cultivate and care for the earth together. So I hope that as we've gone through this, that it's been helpful in thinking through. And even as I read it, I may have some more comments at the end of reading it, but that it's helpful as you go through it and that you question, that even if I didn't hit on something, to please make sure you comment, let me know so that I can help answer it, or at least question it further or give a little bit of insight. Or if you found something interesting that I didn't hit upon, to please also put that in the comment section. So the reading of Genesis 2:4b through 25. On the day the Lord made earth and sky, before any wild plants appeared on the earth and before any field crops grew, because the Lord God hadn't yet sent rain on the earth and there was still no human being to farm the fertile land, though a stream rose from the earth and watered all of the fertile land, the Lord God formed the human from the topsoil of the fertile land and blew life's breath into his nostrils. The human came to life. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east and put there the human he had formed. In the fertile land, the Lord God grew every beautiful tree with edible fruit, and also he grew the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river flows from Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides into 4 headwaters. The name of the first river is the Pishon. It flows around the entire land at Havilah, where there is gold. That land's gold is pure, and the land also has sweet-smelling resins and gemstones. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It flows around the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris, flowing east of Assyria. And the name of the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Lord God took the human and settled him in the Garden of Eden to farm it and to take care of it. The Lord God commanded the human, "Eat your fill from all of the garden's trees, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat from it, you will die." Then the Lord God said, "It's not good that the human is alone. I will make him a helper that is perfect for him." So the Lord God formed from the fertile land all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky and brought them to the human to see what he would name them. The human gave each living being its name. The human named all the livestock, all the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. But a helper perfect for him was nowhere to be found. So the Lord God put the human into a deep and heavy sleep, and took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh over it. With the rib taken from the human, the Lord God fashioned a woman and brought her to the human being. The human said, "This one finally is bone for my bones and flesh for my flesh. She will be called a woman, because from a man she was taken." This is the reason that a man leaves his father and mother and embraces his wife, and they become one flesh. The two of them were naked, the man and his wife, but they weren't embarrassed. So that sense of how even relationships change, that as creation, there are different types of relationships that are created, that there are the familial, and how they develop and change as relationships do. And that there is a sense of, all right, sometimes we have the familia of father, mother, parent, child, and then when we embrace and love another, of how that takes on a very distinctive, very different type of relationship. So just some things to think about, that it covers this sense of what is the relationship between God and humanity? What is the relationship humanity has with all of creation? And then what does the relationship begin to look like between each individual human and others? I hope this brings up some interesting things. I hope it helps and ponder, and may you experience a deeper connection in your life to God and to others. Have a good one.